The morning Julia Bell rode into the Hargrove cattle yard dressed in her dead husband's clothes. She was gambling everything she had left on the slim hope that no one would look too closely at her face. It was the spring of 1874, and the Texas plains stretched out to the horizon like a bolt of sun-bleached canvas, flat and unforgiving and beautiful in the way that only brutal things can be. The air already carried the promise of heat, even at dawn, and the sounds of nearly 2,000 longhorn cattle filled the yard with a low, restless thunder that vibrated in Julia's chest and made her mare stamp her hooves with nervous energy. Julia kept her hat pulled low and her bandana high, the way she had practiced in the cracked mirror above her fireplace back in Caldwell. She had studied her reflection for 3 days straight, learning how to carry her shoulders differently, how to drop her chin just enough, how to walk with a flatness in her hips that she did not naturally possess. She had cut her dark hair short, the longest pieces just brushing her jaw beneath the hat. She had rubbed boot grease into the lines beside her eyes to make them seem rougher. She had borrowed grief itself as a mask, because grief, she had found, has a way of stripping a person down to something that nobody wants to examine too carefully. Her name on the hiring sheet was listed as J. Bell, not Julia, just J. She had done it that way deliberately. The Hargrove outfit was pushing 2,000 head north along the Chisholm Trail, bound for Abilene, Kansas, and they were short on hands after a fever swept through the bunkhouse in March and took 3 men and the foreman with it. The new foreman, a man named Chester Briggs, was 40 years old and nearsighted, and too overwhelmed with logistics to ask many questions about anyone willing to sit a saddle for 12 hours a day. He had looked at Julia's references, which were genuine enough, written by ranchers in Caldwell who had known her late husband Thomas Bell and knew that she could handle stock, and he had shaken her hand with the grip of a man who is already thinking about something else. She had been hired in under 20 minutes. That first day, working cattle from the back of her roan mare, Julia let herself breathe for the first time in 4 months. There was something about the simplicity of the work, the absolute animal demand of it, that quieted the noise in her head. Since Thomas had died in January of the fever that was sweeping every ranch and homestead in South Texas that winter, she had been drowning in the particulars of grief and financial ruin simultaneously, which is a special kind of cruelty the frontier reserves for widows. The land was his. The cattle were his. His brother had come down from San Antonio inside of 2 weeks after the burial and had stood in her kitchen and explained in a polite and utterly merciless way that the deed was in the family name and that she would need to vacate by April. She had loved Thomas Bell. He had been a steady, decent man who laughed at his own jokes and always brought her a piece of hard candy from town and never raised his voice at her in 7 years of marriage. She had wept for him honestly and thoroughly. And then she had counted what was left in the tin box under the floorboard, which was $43 and some change, and she had understood that grief would have to share its space in her chest with something harder and more practical. She needed money. The cattle drive paid $60 for the full run to Abilene, plus a bonus if the herd arrived within the contracted time and over a certain head count. Nearly 4 months of work, and she would have enough to make a start somewhere, to put a deposit on a small piece of ground, to build something. She was 28 years old and she had already buried a husband and been evicted from her own home, and she was not ready to be finished with the world. So she dressed herself in Thomas's trousers and Thomas's flannel shirt and Thomas's worn leather vest, and she rode to Hargrove's yard, and she got herself hired on as a trail hand. For the first 2 weeks of the drive, Julia kept to herself as much as the work would allow, which was not as much as she would have liked. There were 14 hands riding with the outfit, plus Chester Briggs and the cook, an old Mexican man named Esteban who drove the chuck wagon with the dignified authority of a man who knows he is the most important person on any cattle drive and does not feel the need to announce it. The hands ranged from boys who were barely shaving to weathered men in their 40s who had been riding trail since before the war. Most of them were from Texas, some were from further south, and two brothers, the Callaway boys from Arkansas, had the kind of easy, uncomplicated cruelty toward one another that only siblings can sustain without it becoming personal. Nobody paid Julia much attention. She was quiet and she worked hard and she did not complain, and those three qualities are essentially the entire social contract of a cattle drive. She bunked apart from the others, claiming she snored too loud and did not want to start off on the wrong foot, which got a laugh and was accepted without argument. She was careful at the water barrel and at the creek crossings. She ate quickly and slept lightly and kept her hat on from before dawn until after dark. The trail boss arrived on day 14. Julia had not known there would be a trail boss. Chester Briggs had not mentioned one during the hiring, and none of the other hands had spoken of anyone coming to ride out and take charge of the drive. But apparently the Hargroves, the family that owned the outfit, had decided that a drive this size needed more experienced leadership than Chester could provide, and they had sent word ahead to a man who was wintering in San Antonio and who came highly recommended by every cattle operation between the Nueces River and the Red River. His name was Martin Sheridan. Julia first laid eyes on him when she was helping push a cluster of stray steers back into formation along the left flank of the herd. She had her hands full and her attention on the cattle, and she did not see him ride up from the south until he was already alongside Chester, the two men shaking hands on horseback with the kind of practiced economy of movement that marked experienced riders. She saw a tall man on a bay horse, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark coat that was road-dusted and a hat that had been rained on enough times to have found its permanent shape. He was perhaps 32 or 33, she guessed from the distance, with a lean, angular face and a short beard that had been kept up more recently than the coat suggested. He sat his horse like someone who has been on horseback for so long that the saddle feels more natural than a chair. Something about him made her look away quickly, though she could not have said exactly why. He was introduced to the hands that evening at the fire. He was direct and unhurried, and he had the quality that Julia had noticed in a very few men in her life, the quality of making a person feel like they were the only one being addressed even when he was speaking to 14 people at once. He went through the rules of the drive in a quiet, reasonable voice. He talked about river crossings and storm management and keeping the cattle calm. He talked about watches and rotation. He assigned her to the left swing position, which was a middle-range spot on the herd, neither the most demanding nor the lightest work, and he did so without looking at her differently than he looked at anyone else. She decided she was going to be fine. She was wrong. 3 days after Martin Sheridan joined the drive, a late spring norther blew in without much warning, the kind of cold front that sneaks down from the panhandle with a deceptive cheerfulness, and then slaps you across the face at 20 miles an hour. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 4 hours, and the cattle, who had been moving well and quietly, went sideways with nervousness. Julia was on the evening watch when the lead steers started to crowd and shoulder, the low moaning of the herd changing pitch in a way she recognized from years of working stock with Thomas on their ranch. She pushed her mare forward along the flank, trying to ease the pressure, singing low under her breath the way she had learned to do, an old hymn that her mother used to hum in the kitchen, because cattle respond to human voice in the dark in a way that is not entirely explained by anyone who has not experienced it. She held the left flank together for 2 hours in the wind and the cold, moving back and forth, and when the worst of it passed and the cattle settled again into their restless sleepwalking rhythm, she became aware that someone was beside her. She turned and found Martin Sheridan on his bay horse about 15 feet to her right, watching her work with an expression she could not read in the dark. "Good work," he said simply. "Thank you," she said, and caught herself, because her voice had slipped out lower but still had an edge of something in it, something that was not a young man's voice, and she pulled the bandana up instinctively. He did not say anything else. He rode on down the line. But he had heard something. She could feel it the way you can feel a change in the weather before the clouds arrive. The following days tested the whole outfit in the particular and democratic misery that the Chisholm Trail specialized in. They crossed the Washita River 3 days north of Red River Station, and it was running higher than it should have been for the season, swollen by upstream rains that had not touched the trail itself. The cattle did not want to go in, and who could blame them? Getting 2,000 longhorns across a swollen river is a project that involves a great deal of noise and a great deal of prayer and a certain willingness to get wet that cannot be entirely described as voluntary. Julia went in early with 3 of the other hands to establish the crossing line, and she lost a stirrup in the current and went sideways on her mare for a terrifying moment before the horse found her footing and corrected, and Julia came up sputtering and sodden and furious at herself. She made it across. The cattle followed mostly. On the north bank, soaking wet and shaking with cold and adrenaline, she was wringing water out of her hat when Martin Sheridan appeared beside her with a dry blanket from the supply wagon. "Take this," he said. "I am fine," she said. "You are not fine. You are blue around the mouth." He pressed the blanket into her hands with a firmness that was not unkind. "Get changed if you have dry clothes. Hypothermia kills faster than most things on this trail, and it kills stupid, not dramatic. Go." She went because he was not wrong, and because standing there arguing with him while her teeth chattered was not helping her disguise any. She found a screen of cottonwoods 50 yards from camp and changed quickly into the dry set she kept wrapped in oilcloth in her saddlebag. Thomas had always said that keeping one set of clothes dry on a trail was the most important thing a hand could do, and for once she blessed his practical mind thoroughly. She wound fresh cloth around her chest, which was the part of the disguise that required the most daily vigilance and the most discomfort, and she pulled on the dry shirt and vest and stood for a moment in the shade of the cottonwoods just breathing. When she came back to camp, Martin Sheridan was standing at the fire with a tin cup of coffee, talking to Chester about the head count from the crossing. He glanced at her as she came up, and she saw his eyes move over her face for just a fraction too long. She poured herself coffee and turned away. That evening, Esteban made a stew from salt pork and dried beans, and whatever he had managed to rescue from the river crossing, which was more than anyone expected because Esteban was a genius of improvisation, and the outfit ate well, and the mood was good after the difficulty of the crossing. The Calloway brothers got into an argument about something inconsequential, and everyone enjoyed it. One of the younger hands, a boy named Pete who was maybe 19 and doing his first trail drive, played a harmonica badly but with great enthusiasm, and someone threw a boot at him, and he played louder for spite, and the whole thing dissolved into tired laughter. Julia sat a little apart, as she usually did, eating her stew and listening to the sounds of the camp settling for the night, the cattle's low murmuring, the fire crackling, the harmonica. It was not so different, she thought, from evenings on her ranch with Thomas, and the thought was a knife, quick and clean, and she let it pass. "You ride like someone who has been doing it since before they could walk." She looked up. Martin Sheridan had settled onto a log about 6 feet from her, his long legs stretched toward the fire, his coffee cup balanced on his knee. "My father had a cattle operation in West Texas," she said, which was true. "I grew up working stock." "Where in West Texas?" "East of Fort Stockton, small spread." "Also true." He nodded slowly. He was looking at the fire, not at her, and she was grateful for that. "You worked any drives before this one?" he asked. "A couple of shorter ones." "Seasonal work mostly." True again. Thomas had sent her out with the hands twice in their marriage, because he had known what she was capable of and had not been the kind of man to waste it. "You are good with cattle," he said. "The way you handled the flank in the norther, that was not beginner work." "No, sir," she said. He glanced at her then sidelong, and she dropped her gaze to her stew bowl. "You do not have to call me sir," he said. "Martin is fine." "All right," she said, and then, because the silence stretched out a little too long, "Good stew tonight." He smiled at that. It changed his face considerably. "Tell Esteban that he will be your friend for life." She did tell Esteban that the next morning, and Martin Sheridan was correct. The old cook pressed a second biscuit into her hand, with the solemnity of a man bestowing a gift of great value. And from that point on, she received slightly larger portions and the best cuts of whatever meat was going. And this small kindness made the whole enterprise feel slightly more survivable. The drive moved north through the Indian Territory, which white Texans referred to interchangeably as the Territory or as trouble. Though in Julia's experience the greater sources of trouble on any cattle drive were weather, rivers, stampedes, and men with poor judgment, in roughly that order. The Choctaw and the Cherokee had been pushed onto this land by the government, and they ran their own operations here, some of them quite large, and the relationship between Texas Trail drives and the indigenous nations, whose land they were crossing, was complicated and layered with injustice that Julia understood dimly but felt clearly. The Hargrove outfit paid the crossing fee that was levied by the Cherokee Nation for passage through their territory, which not every outfit did, and the ones that did not often found themselves with problems that money would have solved more cheaply. It was while they were moving through the territory that Julia began to understand she was in real trouble with Martin Sheridan, and not in the way she had originally feared. He had taken to riding the left swing position with her in the afternoons, not always, but often enough that the other hands had started making quiet jokes about the trail boss playing favorites. She did not encourage it. She kept her answers short, and her hat pulled low and her focus on the cattle. But Martin Sheridan was a man who had spent years reading landscapes and animals, and he applied that same patient attention to people, and she could feel it working on her like water on stone. He told her in fragments over those afternoon hours about himself. He had grown up in Missouri, outside of Independence, in a family that raised horses. He had come to Texas after the war, the late unpleasantness as he called it, with a flatness that suggested it was anything but, and had found work on ranches, had worked his way up from wrangler to segundo to trail boss over 8 years of driving cattle north along routes that were still being mapped as people traveled them. He had a sister in Missouri who wrote him letters he sometimes went months without being able to answer. He had never married, never found the time, or never found the right person. She asked once before she could stop herself, and then regretted it immediately. He was quiet for a moment, watching the cattle. "Both, maybe," he said finally. "Mostly I never found someone I could talk to and not feel like I was performing something." She did not have an answer for that. She looked straight ahead at the backs of the moving cattle and felt something warm move through her chest that she absolutely could not afford. The night it finally happened, it came not from any romantic moment but from the most practical and inescapable of circumstances. A rattlesnake in the grass 30 yards from camp. Her horse spooked hard, and Julia went over the mare's shoulder and landed flat on her back with an impact that drove the air out of her in a single violent gust and knocked her hat clean off her head. She lay there for a stunned second, staring at the sky, her bandana somewhere under her and her hat gone, and her short hair loose and dark around her face in the evening light. Martin Sheridan was at her side before she had gathered herself enough to sit up, crouching beside her, one hand on her shoulder, saying her name, saying, "Belle, Belle, are you hurt? Can you move?" And she was already reaching for her hat when he stopped. He went still. She froze. He was looking at her face, not at her hat, not at her bandana. At her face and at her eyes specifically, which were a shade of gray-green that was specific and unusual, and that he had apparently been carrying in some corner of his memory for longer than either of them knew. "Julia," he said. "Not Belle, Julia." Her blood went cold. "You have the wrong person," she said, and her voice came out completely wrong, female and clear, and nothing like the rough lower register she had been maintaining for weeks. "Julia Anders," he said. "That was your name before. I knew your father in Fort Stockton. You were about 14. You had those eyes then, too." She sat up fully and looked him in the face and understood that the game was over, and something in her went very quiet and very still, the way things go quiet in the moment before a decision. "My name is Julia Bell now," she said. "My husband died in January. His family took the land. I needed to work." Martin Sheridan sat back on his heels and looked at her for a long time. The evening light was turning everything amber and the cattle were settling, and somewhere across Camp Esteban was clanging something against the side of the chuck wagon in the preparatory way that meant supper was coming. "You have been working this drive for 3 weeks," he said slowly. "Yes." "And nobody," he started again. "You are a woman." "I am aware," she said dryly. "I was there for both facts." Something moved across his face. It might have been the beginning of a laugh that he swallowed back out of respect for the gravity of the situation. "Julia, I know what it is," she said. She picked up her hat from where it had fallen and placed it back on her head, tucking the loose hair up under the brim with practiced hands. "I am a good hand. I have done the work. If you are going to send me back, I would ask you to at least consider that I have 3 weeks of wages owed, which I will need regardless because I have nothing else." He was quiet. He stood up from his crouch and looked off toward the horizon, and she watched the set of his shoulders, trying to read what was coming. "You are a good hand," he said finally. "That is the honest truth of it. You rode the norther better than half my men." "I know the work," she said. "You do." He turned back to her. "If I keep this between us, I need to know it will not become a problem. Not for you, not for the outfit." "It has not become a problem yet," she said. "I can finish the drive." He looked at her for another long moment, and she looked back, and the light was warm and the whole world smelled like cattle and dust and spring grass, and she did not look away. "All right," he said. "Belle." And he said it the way he had said it before, flat and professional, but with something different underneath it now, something she did not know how to name. He told no one. She watched for it in the days that followed, watching for the sidelong looks from other men, the whispered conversations, the change in how she was treated, and none of it came. Martin Sheridan kept her secret with the same quiet competence he applied to everything else, and she found herself grateful in a way that was almost physical, a loosening in her chest that she had not known was clenched. But knowing, on his end, changed things in ways neither of them had planned. He rode the left swing with her most afternoons now, and the conversation between them, which had already been easier than she was comfortable with, became easier still. He knew who she was now, or enough of who she was, and she no longer had to maintain the particular exhaustion of shaping every sentence through a filter. She kept the hat and the bandana and the posture, because the other hands did not know, and she saw no reason to introduce complications. But with Martin, in those afternoon hours on horseback with 2,000 cattle moving around them like a slow brown river, she was something closer to herself. She told him about Thomas. About the 7 years of the marriage, which had been good and steady without being remarkable, and she felt no guilt about saying that because Thomas himself would have agreed and would have considered it a compliment. About the land and the cattle they had built together, all of it gone now to the brother who had never worked a day of it. "That is not right," Martin said. "No," she agreed. "It is not. But being right and being legal are not always the same thing, and I have found that the law tends to agree more with the person who has the deed." "What will you do after Abilene?" he asked. "There is land available in Kansas, small tracts, reasonable prices for a woman who has some money and knows what she is doing." She had been thinking about it for weeks. She had been specific in her research before she left Caldwell, talking to men who had been through Abilene, finding out about opportunities. "I can start small, I know how." He was quiet for a while, then, "You have thought this through." "I have thought about very little else for 4 months," she said. "You are not afraid of it, starting over, alone?" She considered the question honestly. "I am terrified of it," she said, "but I am more terrified of the alternative, which is doing nothing and watching the money run out." He looked at her then, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen directed at her from anyone in a long time. It was respect, clean and uncomplicated, and it settled over her like the warmth from a well-built fire. The night of the stampede, Julia proved herself so thoroughly that even the hands who had harbored small skepticisms about the quiet, slight cowboy on the roan mare had nothing left to say. It started the way stampedes always start, which is to say without warning and with catastrophic speed. A clap of dry lightning to the northwest. The cattle went from standing to running in approximately 4 seconds, and what had been a herd of 2,000 longhorns became 2,000 points of horn and hooves moving in the dark at a pace that made the earth shake. Julia was on the night watch, which meant she was already horseback and moving before half the camp was awake, and she pushed her mare hard into the flank of the stampede, not trying to stop it, because stopping a stampede is a myth, but trying to turn it, to curve the lead animal's left, to bring the whole catastrophe around on itself into a mill, a circle, where the cattle would run themselves down without destroying anything in their path. She worked the flank for 2 hours in the dark, her mare proving herself the best horse on the drive, turning on instinct and reading the cattle better than most trained cutting horses. She pushed and she held and she pressed, and when she was nearly at the point of the lead steers, she heard someone come up on her right and she knew without looking that it was Martin on the bay. He did not tell her what to do. They had never worked together in an emergency before, but they moved together with an instinctive cooperation that was almost uncanny, adjusting and countering and pressing, and slowly, painfully slowly, the great wheel of the herd began to turn. It took until nearly midnight. When the stampede finally exhausted itself into a milling confusion and the lead steers slowed to a trot and then a walk and the rest followed, Julia sat on her blowing, lathered mare and shook from head to foot with the pure release of adrenaline. Martin pulled up beside her. He was breathing hard and his hat was gone and his hair was dark with sweat. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. And then, because her defenses were somewhat reduced by the experience, "That was the finest horse I have ever ridden." "I was thinking the same about mine," he said, and the grin that broke across his face in the moonlight was the most unguarded expression she had seen on him, and it did something to her that she was going to have to think about later when she was not in the middle of a dark prairie surrounded by confused cattle. They spent the next day counting heads and finding the scattered animals and pushing them back. The final count showed they had lost 11 head to the stampede, which Chester said was remarkable given the severity of it, and Martin said nothing but looked at Julia for a moment longer than was strictly professional. The outfit had made it through the Indian Territory and was approaching the Kansas line, which meant they were perhaps 3 weeks from Abilene, and the drive had settled into the particular rhythm that comes when the worst of the obstacles are behind you and the end is close enough to imagine but not so close that you stop paying attention. The weather was warmer, the land was greener, and the cattle were walking well and putting on condition on the good grass. Julia was sitting at the fire one evening, alone for once, Esteban having retired early, and the other hands occupied with cards and conversation on the far side of camp, when Martin came and sat beside her. Not 6 feet away on a log as he had done that first night, beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth from his arm, she looked at the fire. "I owe you an honest conversation," he said. "You do not owe me anything," she said carefully. "I want to have one anyway." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "When I recognized you, when I understood what you had done and why, I expected to feel, I am not sure what I expected to feel, something like disapproval maybe. Concern for the drive. Instead what I felt was," he stopped. She waited. "Admiration," he said, "and something else that took me longer to identify because I have not had much occasion for it recently." She looked at him then. The firelight was kind to his face, and he was looking at her with an expression that was careful and honest and not at all practiced. "Martin," she said. "I am not saying it to complicate things," he said. "I know this is the worst possible context. I know you are in a situation that has nothing to do with—" He stopped again and let out a breath. "But I am 33 years old and I have been on cattle drives for 8 years and I have never once felt, riding beside anyone, what I feel riding beside you in the afternoons, and I think it would be dishonest not to say so." The fire crackled. Off in the dark, one of the Calloway brothers said something sharp to the other, and there was brief laughter. "What you feel," she said slowly. "What is that exactly?" "Like I could ride to the end of the world and not want to stop," he said. "Like the day has a shape it did not have before." Julia Bell, who had been managing herself very carefully for 4 months, who had not let herself feel much of anything that was not strictly necessary for survival, felt something crack open in her chest. It was not unpleasant. It was terrifying and warm and completely inconvenient, and she looked back at the fire and tried to think clearly. "I'm a widow on a cattle drive pretending to be a man," she said. "I have $43 to my name and plans that depend on reaching Abilene and collecting wages. I am not in a position to. I am not asking you to be in a position to anything," he said quietly. "I just needed to say it, because I find I am not built for leaving things unsaid when I know what they are." She was quiet for a long moment. The cattle moved in the dark beyond the firelight, the slow sounds of the herd settling. The stars above the Kansas plains were extraordinary, the kind of sky that makes you feel small in a way that is not unpleasant. "I find I am not entirely unaffected," she said finally with great precision. He was quiet too, and then, "All right. All right," she agreed. They sat beside each other at the fire for another hour, and they did not say much more, and it was, Julia thought privately, one of the better evenings she could remember. The following weeks carried a quality of suspended possibility that was entirely new to her experience of the drive and of her life in general. Nothing changed overtly. She still worked the left swing. He still rode the trail boss's position, ranging the length of the herd, solving problems, reading the land ahead. But there was a different quality to the moments when they were beside each other, a kind of charged awareness that she had not felt in a very long time, and that she permitted herself to acknowledge in the privacy of her own mind. She also began to understand in those weeks what kind of man Martin Sheridan was in a way that went beyond what he had told her. She watched him with the hands. He was fair in a way that was not always comfortable, because he held the same standards for everyone including himself, and he did not make exceptions for lickability. When the younger Calloway brother, whose name was Denny, made a costly error pushing a group of steers across a creek and lost 4 animals because he had not read the footing on the far bank, Martin took him aside and talked to him for 20 minutes, and Denny came back looking simultaneously chastened and grateful. She saw the way he treated Esteban, with the respect of one professional for another, and the way he talked to Pete the harmonica player with a patience that was not condescension. She saw him, once, hand money quietly from his own pocket to a hand named Reuben whose gear had been lost in a river crossing, without any acknowledgement or ceremony. These things accumulated in Julia's chest the way significant things do, not dramatically but steadily, the way water rises. It was 2 weeks from Abilene when the confrontation came, and it came, as most confrontations do, from the direction she had least expected it. One of the older hands, a man named Sutherland who had been on trail drives since before the war, and who had the particular rigidity of a man who had survived many things by being the same way about all of them, had apparently begun paying closer attention to Julia than she realized. She did not know how long he had suspected. He came to her one morning early when she was saddling the roan, and he stood at the edge of the corral rope and looked at her with the flat, evaluating look of a man preparing to make a business proposition. "I know what you are," he said. She turned and looked at him. "All right," she said. "I also know you've been riding with the trail boss quite a lot," he said. "More than is strictly necessary." "He assigns the positions," she said. "That is what I mean," Sutherland said. He was not threatening exactly. He was positioning. "I imagine it would cause a considerable disruption if the other hands were to know." She looked at him steadily. "What is it you want, Mr. Sutherland?" "I have a loan payment due in September," he said. "It is not a large amount in the context of a trail drive bonus." She understood him perfectly. She also understood that she had approximately nothing to offer him, and that the decision about how to handle this was not entirely hers to make anymore. "I will need until tonight to give you an answer," she said. "Fair enough," he said, and walked away. She found Martin at midday. She told him plainly and without drama what Sutherland had said. She watched his face while she spoke, and she saw the anger move through it like a weather system, controlled and internal, and then resolve into something cooler and more deliberate. "That is not going to happen," he said. "I know," she said. "But let me handle Sutherland," he said. "He is wrong about what will happen if the hands know. I suspect most of them have more sense than he gives them credit for." "Martin, I cannot ask you to. You did not ask," he said. "I am offering. There is a difference." That evening, Martin Sheridan called the hands together before supper, and he stood in front of the fire and he told them. He told them that J. Bell was Julia Bell, a widow from Caldwell, and that she had joined the drive because she needed to work, and that she had done the work as well as anyone on the outfit, and that anyone who had a problem with that was welcome to express it, and they would discuss it like adults. There was a silence that lasted for about 10 seconds. Pete, the harmonica player, said, "Well, that explains the snoring." There was a laugh, and then another, and the tension dissolved in the way that tension sometimes does when it turns out to have been mostly air. Esteban said he had known since the second week, which surprised no one who had observed how carefully he had been feeding her. One of the hands from South Texas said his own mother had ridden stock, and he did not see what the fuss was. Chester Briggs looked as though he was recalibrating several things at once, but arrived eventually at a nod. Sutherland said nothing. He collected his wages 2 days later at a wide spot in the trail where there was a small settlement, and he rode south, and Julia watched him go without much feeling either way except relief. That night, for the first time on the drive, she sat with the rest of the hands at the fire, hat off, hair loose around her jaw, and ate her supper in full view of everyone. It felt strange, and then it felt fine, and then, after Pete played his harmonica badly for a while and she laughed at something one of the other hands said, it felt almost natural. She was still J. Bell to most of them. That was fine. Martin sat beside her close, in the way he had been sitting beside her since the night at the fire, and nobody said anything about it except one of the Calloway brothers, the older one whose name was Wayne, who said with the bluntness of a man who has spent too much time in the open air, "You two figured out yet that you're sweet on each other," Julia said. "Mind your own cattle, Calloway." Wayne said, "Yes, ma'am," and grinned, and that was more or less the end of it. They crossed into Kansas on a morning that was so clear and blue it seemed to have been made for the specific purpose of marking occasions. The Cimarron River was behind them, the Arkansas River ahead, and beyond that Abilene, where the cattle would be sold and the wages paid and the drive officially concluded. The mood of the outfit was high, the way it always gets close to the end, a fizzing energy that made even the cattle seem to walk with more purpose. Julia rode beside Martin for most of that day, not because of position assignment but simply because that was where they both ended up, and the conversation moved between practical matters, the final count of the herd, the condition of the animals, the projected arrival time, and other things, quieter things, that she found herself in the middle of before she quite knew how they had started. He told her about independence, about the horse farm, about a childhood that had been hard and good in the way that working childhoods often are. He told her about the war in sparse sentences that she did not push beyond, because she could hear what the spare language was containing. He told her about coming to Texas and what it had meant to him to find work that suited his nature, that required the specific combination of patience and decisiveness that he apparently had, and that had not found its purpose in Missouri. She told him about growing up east of Fort Stockton, her father's cattle, the particular quality of West Texas light in the late afternoon that she had never found anywhere else. She told him about Thomas, more of it this time, the good parts and the hard parts, because she found with Martin that she could say the complicated things without them needing to be simplified. She told him about the January morning she had understood he was not going to recover, and the specific terrible practicality that had descended on her grief almost immediately, like a second sky falling. "You did not let it stop you," he said. "I could not afford to," she said. "No," he agreed. "But some people cannot afford to stop and stop anyway. You found another way." She considered that. "I borrowed a dead man's clothes and pretended to be someone I am not for 2 months," she said. "You kept yourself alive and moving," he said. "That is not nothing, Julia." The way he said her name had changed. It had started out as a revelation, on the night he recognized her, sharp and surprising. It had moved through something careful and professional. Now it sounded like something he had been saying for years. Abilene appeared on the horizon 2 days before they reached it, the way distant towns do on the Kansas plains, as a kind of thickening of the horizon, a suggestion of vertical lines among all that horizontal space. As they drew closer, it resolved into buildings, into the smell of the stockyards that hit them from miles away with its particular pungent democracy, into the noise of other drives already arrived, and the sounds of commerce that followed cattle from Texas all the way to railroad connection. The town of Abilene in the spring of 1874 was a peculiar place, like most cattle towns of its era, part functional commerce and part barely controlled chaos, with businesses that served the legitimate needs of the trail trade and others that served the less legitimate needs of men who had been on the trail for months and suddenly had money. There were saloons and hotels and a proper bank and a stockyard office and a marshal's office that existed in a state of perpetual negotiation with the reality it was meant to manage. They pushed the herd into the stockyards in stages through the morning, and the count was conducted with the precision that large amounts of money require, and by early afternoon the Hargrove representative, a man named Aldred who wore a suit that suggested he had not spent the previous 2 months on horseback, was doing sums in a ledger and writing checks and cash payments in a sequence that produced, in Julia's hands, $62.50. The basic wage plus a condition bonus because the cattle had arrived in good order. She stood in the stockyard office with the money in her hand and felt a feeling she could not entirely name. It was not just relief, though it was that. It was something that had to do with having gotten here by her own labor, with having held the left flank of 2,000 cattle through a norther and a river crossing and a stampede and the ordinary exhausting demands of 2 months on the Chisholm Trail, and arriving at this specific moment with this specific proof in her hand that she had done it. She looked up from the money. Martin was standing in the doorway of the stockyard office. He had been paid already, and he was leaning against the frame, watching her with the quiet attention that she had come to understand as his particular form of care. "$62.50, she said. 43 and change becomes 105, he said. "That is a start." "It is," she said. "It is a real start." They walked out into the Abilene afternoon together, the hands dispersing around them in the cheerful centrifugal way that trail hands always disperse at the end of a drive, and Esteban shook Julia's hand with great formality, and then pressed a small paper packet of dried chilies into the other, a parting gift, and turned his mule toward the southbound road with the dignified finality of a man who has completed his work and intends to rest. The town absorbed the rest of the outfit the way Abilene absorbed everyone, without much ceremony. Julia and Martin walked along the main street in the late afternoon light, not going anywhere in particular, which was its own kind of luxury after 2 months of going somewhere specific at all times. She had found a dress, or at least a proper shirt and skirt, at the dry goods store, and had changed in the back room while the proprietress looked at her with polite bafflement. She had her hair pinned up and her hat on, and she felt strange and right in equal measure, something like herself again, except that she was not certain who that was any more, not entirely. "I have been thinking," Martin said, as they walked past the hotel and the telegraph office and a saloon that was already producing considerable noise for mid-afternoon. "About what?" she asked. "About the land in Kansas you mentioned," he said, "the small tracts." "Yes. I have been on trail drives for 8 years," he said. "I have saved money. Not extravagantly, but more than a man needs who spends most of his time on horseback and does not drink to excess or gamble seriously." He paused. "I have been thinking for a while now about what comes after the drives. I am 33. The work gets harder on the body." She was watching the street ahead of them very carefully. "Martin," she said, "I am not rushing anything," he said. "I know the timing is. I know we have known each other on the trail, which is a specific context. I know you have your own plans and your own money and your own capable mind, which I would not wish to override for anything. But I am asking you to consider." He stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to face him. They were on the boardwalk outside the land office, which she noticed with a slight sense of the universe having a sense of humor. "I am asking you to consider that two people who work well together and who can talk to each other honestly and who—" He stopped again, and something softened in his expression, something that was not uncertainty exactly but was close to it, which was the most vulnerable she had seen him look. "Who feel the way I feel when we ride together," he finished. The afternoon sun was at that particular angle that makes everything in Kansas look like a painting of Kansas, golden and clean and slightly too beautiful to be entirely real. And Martin Sheridan was standing in front of her with his hat in his hand, and his expression open in a way she suspected he did not often permit himself. And Julia Bell, who had survived a husband's death and an eviction, and 2 months on the Chisholm Trail dressed as a man, felt something that she recognized after a moment as happiness. It was smaller and quieter and more sensible than the happiness in stories, but it was real, which was better. "I am going to look at the land records tomorrow," she said. "Whether I go alone or with someone else, I am going to do that." "Of course," he said, "and whatever I decide about the land, I decide," she said. "I am not looking to put myself in a position where someone else holds the deed again." "I would not have it any other way," he said, and she heard the truth of it. "Then," she said, "I think you should take me to supper, at the hotel dining room, and we should talk about it properly without cattle." The slow smile that moved across his face was the best thing she had seen since that moment in the moonlight after the stampede, and she filed it away in the same careful place. "Yes, ma'am," he said. The hotel dining room in Abilene was not elegant by any measure that would have satisfied someone with refined tastes, but it had tablecloths and proper chairs, and a menu written in someone's optimistic cursive on a chalkboard, and it smelled like bread and coffee. And after 2 months of eating beside a chuck wagon, it was the finest restaurant Julia could imagine. They ate roast beef and potatoes and drank actual coffee from actual cups, and they talked for 3 hours. They talked about the land and what was realistic for it, for farming or for running cattle or for some combination of the two. They talked about Martin's savings, which were honest and concrete, and her wages, and what was possible. They talked about the legal question of property and how to structure things, because Julia was not going to make the same mistake twice. And Martin said, without any trace of defensiveness, that whatever land they bought together would be in both their names. And if she wanted a lawyer to put that on paper before anything else happened, she considered that both wise and reasonable. They talked about Missouri, about whether his sister would come to visit, and Julia said she hoped so, because she had always wanted to have a sister-in-law and had never had the opportunity. Martin had looked at her sharply then, and she had looked back steadily, and they had both understood that they were not talking about something hypothetical. "I want to say something," he said. "All right," she said. "I have not been in love before," he said. "Not this way. I was careful about using that word because I wanted to be sure I knew what I was saying. I am sure now." He met her eyes. "I love you, Julia Bell. I fell in love with you somewhere between the Washita crossing and the stampede, and it has only gotten more definite since." The candle on the table was unsteady in the draft from the door, and the dining room had cleared out around them without either of them noticing. And Julia looked at the man across the table from her and thought about what it meant to have been broken open by grief and hardship, and to have arrived on the other side of all of it at something like this. "I love you too," she said. It came out simply because it was simple, not uncomplicated, simple. "I did not expect to. I was not looking for it. But there it is." He reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat like that for a while in the empty dining room, and it was quiet and good. The land office opened at 8 in the morning, and they were there at 5 minutes past. Julia with her notebook and her questions, and her particular combination of pragmatism and vision that had carried her this far. Martin beside her with his savings figures and his willingness to listen, while she led the conversation. The man behind the counter was named Albright, and he was clearly unaccustomed to women asking questions about land acquisition. But Julia's questions were precise, and her knowledge was evident, and she did not allow his discomfort to interrupt her inquiry. They found a tract 20 miles south of Abilene, along a creek that Albright said ran year-round, 320 acres of good grassland with an existing claim structure that meant the basic improvements were already in place. It was within their combined means. It was exactly the right size for two people starting out. Julia walked around the table and looked at the survey map for a long time, tracing the creek line with her finger, noting the lay of the land. "This one," she said. "You are certain?" Martin asked. "I have been thinking about this for 4 months," she said. "I know what I am looking for." He trusted her judgment. She noticed that specifically, that he trusted her judgment without needing to verify it against his own. And she thought that this, more than anything, was what she had been looking for without knowing it. They arranged the purchase with a lawyer on the main street, a small, earnest man named Greer who drafted the deed with both their names on it, and who had the good sense to treat this as the unremarkable transaction it ought to have been, and not as anything unusual. And Julia signed her name next to Martin's, and felt the paper under her hands as something solid and real. Martin Sheridan asked her to marry him that evening, on the boardwalk outside the hotel, plainly and without theatrical staging, the way he did most things, and she said yes with equal plainness, because they were both people who meant what they said and did not require decoration to say it. They were married in Abilene 6 days later, by a minister named Hawthorne who was accustomed to performing expedient ceremonies for people passing through and who treated theirs with appropriate dignity. Pete the harmonica player, who had not yet left Abilene because he had found the town agreeable and had not decided where he was going next, attended with great enthusiasm and played something celebratory and slightly unidentifiable on his harmonica afterward. And Julia laughed at it in a way that came from very deep and was completely unguarded. The ride out to the land, their land, took most of a day, and they did it together on their horses, the roan mare and the bay gelding moving side by side across the Kansas grassland in the late spring that was moving toward summer. The land was exactly what the survey map had suggested, open and green and cut through by the creek that ran clean and cold. The existing claim structure was a small house, barely that, more of a large cabin with a good roof and a serviceable fireplace, and a barn that was solid and adequate for a beginning. They stood in front of the house in the evening light and looked at it. Julia felt the weight of everything that had brought her here: Thomas's death, the eviction, the long strange months of disguise and hard work, and the gradual opening of something she had thought was permanently closed, and she held it all together for a moment with something that was not quite sorrow and not quite joy but contained both. Martin put his arm around her, not tentatively, firmly, the way he did things because he was sure of it. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking it needs a lot of work," she said. "It does," he agreed, "and I am thinking I know how to do most of it." "So do I," he said. And she said, leaning into him in the easy way that had developed between them, "I am thinking that 4 months ago I was sitting in my kitchen counting $43 and wondering if I was finished, and now I am standing here." He pressed his mouth against her hair. "You were never going to be finished. he said. "That was always obvious." She laughed, and the sound of it went out across the prairie and the creek and the open Kansas sky with nothing to stop it. The first year was the kind of difficult that is also deeply satisfying, the particular texture of work that is your own, for your own purpose, on your own ground. They built on the existing cabin through the summer, adding a proper kitchen and a second room. They ran a small cattle operation, starting with 40 head that Martin purchased at the end of the Abilene season from a rancher who was dispersing his herd, and they put up hay for the winter with the industriousness of people who know exactly what happens if you do not have enough hay. Martin wrote to his sister in Missouri, whose name was Clara, and Clara wrote back with a warmth and curiosity about Julia that told Julia a great deal about what kind of person Clara was before they ever met. They exchanged letters through that first year, and by the time Clara came to visit the following spring, Julia felt that she already knew her. Clara Sheridan was 30 years old, small and sharp-eyed and direct in a way that made it immediately clear she and Martin were related, and she arrived from Independence on the stage with 2 large bags and the air of someone who has been wanting to do this for a while. She stood in the yard of the ranch and looked at everything with the frank assessment of someone who grew up around working land. And then she looked at Julia and smiled the way Martin smiled, from one side first and then the other, and said, "He wrote me you have good eyes." He was not wrong. He has always been very bad at describing people adequately. Julia said, "He described you as formidable and resourceful." "Well," Clara said, pleased, "that is better." They became, over the following days of that visit, something very close to the sisters they had both lacked. Clara had opinions about the kitchen layout and Julia disagreed with most of them but found the conversation invigorating. They rode out together to look at the cattle, and Clara was a competent horsewoman, and Martin trailed behind them on the bay horse with the expression of a man who is watching something he hoped for come true. It was in the late summer of that first year that Julia understood she was expecting. She told Martin in the early morning before dawn, while they were both still in that half-awake state where things said feel more honest than usual. She told him simply, and he was quiet for a long moment, and then he put his hand over hers, and she could feel from his breathing that he was moved in a way that had no words quite adequate to it. Their son was born in the spring of 1876, on a morning that came in with wind and left with sunshine, which seemed appropriate. He was delivered by a capable midwife from the settlement 6 miles west named Mrs. Garland, who had done this work for 20 years and who managed the whole enterprise with calm authority that Julia deeply appreciated. The baby was large and healthy and loud, which also seemed appropriate given his parentage, and Martin sat beside the bed with the shell-shocked tenderness of a first-time father, and looked at his son with an expression of complete bewilderment and complete love occurring simultaneously. They named him Thomas Anders Sheridan, the first name for the steady, decent man who had been Julia's first husband and who deserved to be remembered, the middle name for her father. Martin had suggested it himself, which told her everything she needed to know about the man she had married. Thomas, who went by Tom almost immediately, grew from an infant into a small, determined person who had his father's quietness and his mother's stubborn refusal to stop when things became difficult. He was on a horse before he was 3, which was slightly alarming and also inevitable given the household he had been born into. He had Martin's steady gray eyes and Julia's dark hair, and a quality of attention that was entirely his own, the way children arrive as themselves from the very beginning, and then proceed to show you who they already were. The ranch grew steadily over those years, not dramatically but in the patient compounding way of well-managed land. By 1878 they had over 100 head of cattle and had added a proper barn and a bunkhouse for the 2 hands they had taken on. Martin still did occasional trail consultation work in the spring, advising outfits on routes and river crossings, because his knowledge was valuable, and he enjoyed keeping his hand in. and Julia ran the ranch operation with the competence and authority of someone who had been doing variations of this work for most of her life. They had arguments, because they were both people with strong views and neither of them had much practice in tolerating disagreement without engaging it. They argued about cattle management, and about money and once, memorably, about whether the east pasture fence needed to be entirely rebuilt or could be repaired. A disagreement that lasted 3 days and was resolved in Julia's favor when the fence fell down on its own, and she had the good grace not to say anything specific about it. The arguments never went where they could not come back from. She had not expected that, not consciously. She had not known it was possible, because most of the marriages she had observed in her life had a quality of managed distance that passed for compatibility. What she and Martin had was something different, a genuine encounter of two people who did not reduce themselves in order to get along, and it was occasionally uncomfortable and consistently worth it. In 1879, Clara came again from Missouri, and this time she brought a man with her, a quiet widower from Independence named Gerald who ran a hardware supply business, and who looked at Clara the way Martin looked at Julia, which is to say with the full attention of someone who intends to be there. Julia liked Gerald almost immediately. Tom, who was 3 by then, decided Gerald was his personal property, and spent the entirety of the visit attached to his side, which Gerald bore with enormous good humor. That visit was when Clara and Julia had the conversation that Julia had been waiting for without knowing it, late at night in the kitchen while Martin and Gerald were out on the porch talking about the sort of things men talk about on porches in the evening. Clara said, "He was different before you." Not unhappy but sealed off somehow, like he had decided not to need things, and now he is just himself. Julia looked at her coffee cup. "He unsealed me too," she said. "I know," Clara said. "I could see it in the letters." They were quiet for a moment. 2 women at a kitchen table in Kansas in 1879, in the lamplight, with the sounds of their men on the porch and the child asleep in the back room and the cattle outside in the dark. And Julia thought about all the roads that had led here, every one of them hard and some of them brutal, and how the destination could not have been predicted from any point along them. By the time their daughter arrived in the winter of 1880, they were settled in the particular deep way of people who have made their place in the world through genuine effort rather than inheritance. The girl was born in December, which was not ideal timing but which she managed with complete disregard for anyone's scheduling preferences, the way second children often do. She was smaller than Tom had been, quick-eyed and alert from the first hours, and she fixed Martin with a stare on the day she was born that made him say, with complete seriousness, "I suspect she is going to be a considerable amount to handle." "Yes," Julia said from the bed, tired and complete and luminous in the way that women sometimes are immediately after surviving something enormous. "She is going to be magnificent." They named her Clara Ruth Sheridan, Clara for Martin's sister, Ruth for Julia's mother, and when real Clara received the letter in Missouri, she wrote back so quickly that the ink was slightly smeared, and the letter was 3 pages long, and the first sentence was, "I am completely undone in the best possible way." The years moved the way good years do, not slowly, not quickly, but with the quality of days that have enough in them to be fully inhabited. Tom grew into a serious, capable boy who was developing his father's gift with animals, and his mother's habit of asking the next question after everyone else had stopped asking. Little Clara, who was called Ruthie by nearly everyone except her father who called her Clara on principle, was the opposite of serious in every way, which balanced the household considerably and kept it interesting. There was a morning in the spring of 1882, 8 years after the cattle drive, when Julia was riding the east pasture checking the fence line, the repaired and sturdy fence line that had never fallen again, and she stopped on a rise that gave a view south and west across the grassland, the creek shining in the middle distance, the ranch buildings below, smoke from the kitchen chimney, the cattle spread across the good pasture, Tom's voice audible even from here, calling to his father about something involving the horses. She sat her horse, the roan mare's daughter now, a fine horse in her own right, and she looked at all of it. And she thought about a morning in Caldwell with $43 and a dead husband's clothes, and a decision that had felt like desperation, and had turned out to be the beginning of everything. She heard hoofbeats and turned to find Martin coming up the rise on the bay's successor, a strong chestnut horse he had bought 2 years ago and was very pleased about. He rode up beside her and stopped and looked at what she was looking at. "Tom says the north fence needs work," he said. "Tom is probably right," she said. "He usually is," Martin agreed. "Takes after his mother." She looked at him. He was 41 now, the beard more thoroughly gray than brown, the lines beside his eyes deep from years of squinting across plains and rivers and the distance between here and there. He was the same as he had been on the trail, and he was entirely different, the way people are when they have been loved properly for a long time. He looked at her and smiled, the whole smile, both sides at once. "What are you thinking?" he asked, the way he always asked. She looked back at the ranch below them, at the smoke and the cattle and the children's voices and the green spring land and the shining creek, and she thought about 2,000 longhorns moving north under a Texas sky, and a hat pulled low, and a roan mare, and a trail boss on a bay horse who had looked at her eyes and seen her. "I am thinking," she said, "that it turned out to be a very good decision." He took her hand across the gap between their horses, the way they had been taking each other's hands for 8 years, easily and without ceremony, as though this was the most natural thing in the world, which it was. "The best one," he said. She squeezed his hand, and they sat like that on the rise above their land, in the good Kansas morning, while their children called to each other below, and the cattle grazed, and the creek ran, and the spring carried its smell of wet earth and new grass across the whole wide country, and everything that had needed to be built had been built, and everything that had needed to be found had been found, and the day stretched ahead of them, full of work and full of belonging, exactly as it should be.